Hi there. Okay, so we are talking today about the constitutional structure of American federalism. So section 3.2, I understand we already did 3.3. I kind of tend to jump around, as you might know. Okay, so this is not a super long section. What we're really looking at is, as we've talked about before, about how a constitution is what divides power, right, in federalism between national government and state and local governments. It's not the federal government saying, yes, state governments, you can do this, although sometimes they do. Like sometimes they willingly give up power, okay, and that's fine. In this particular instance, or in most instances, I should say, federalism, the Constitution is what gives the powers through, of course, the 10th Amendment, as we talked about, through very specific areas of the Constitution that either grants the federal government power or grants the states power. That's what we're talking about today, is the constitutional structure of federalism. Like, why do we have federalism? What in the Constitution kind of lends itself to that? All right, we talked about, all the different type of powers last week. So delegated or expressed, remember, are powers that are given to the federal government in the Constitution. Very specifically, they're listed. Enumerated falls under the umbrella of delegated or expressed, except enumerated are just given to Congress. Implied powers are powers that are implied from the Constitution. We infer those powers. Those come from the necessary and proper clauses, we know. Inherent powers are because we're the government, that's why, like those powers, like kind of this, it's not listed, but like who else would do that? Like buying, more land for the US is a good example. Reserved powers come from the 10th Amendment. Those are reserved to states. And concurrent powers are powers that are shared by multiple levels of government. Okay, that's just a nice little review. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, one of the most important clauses in the Constitution. What is it? This is one of the only ones that you should know by like article, section, clause. That would be the necessary and proper clause. Okay, it's one of the most important clauses that exists in the Constitution. So the necessary and proper clause states that Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the government of the United States. So basically saying they can make a lot of laws that are not necessarily already, within their specified powers, but that would help them carry out their specified powers. And then like beyond. Okay, so as we know, like there's a reason why this is called the elastic clause, right? It's stretching of the powers. Obviously, necessary and proper clause extends the power of the national government. And what it does also is keeps the Constitution a living document, right? We've talked about that. Why is it that the necessary and proper clause exists? Well, part of the reason is because the founders knew that like there's other things that they didn't think of that would come up. So in that instance, it was good foresight. All right, so as we know, in the U.S., the ultimate authority is the federal government. So yes, there is state powers. States have authority some places. However, the federal government is ultimately in charge. 4 areas of the Constitution that state that specifically, okay? They are the Supremacy Clause, as we know, the War Powers. We don't really call it War Powers Clause. It's just like, where is war power granted to? The Commerce Clause and the power to tax and spend. Okay, Supremacy Clause, as we know, is Article 6. It is the most important pillar of American federalism. Okay, so federalism, again, is a constitutionally granted division of power between national and state and local governments. Okay, we got that. We already know that. But at some point, the push and pull has to end, right? So like the buck has to stop somewhere. And so when they're creating our new form of government and like drafting the Constitution, they're like, okay, we're fine giving states some power, but like what happens if there's a, kind of a conflict between a state law and a federal law? Who's going to win? And so they wrote in this Supremacy Clause, it says that that the Constitution and all laws made, under it, national laws, would be the supreme law of the land. Okay. Which means that state and local governments cannot ignore federal law. If state or local law conflicts with federal law wins. But states are sometimes allowed to broaden or tighten things based on their individual needs. Again, California emission standards is a really good example of that, meaning like there's so much, air pollution in California that they tightened what the standard is beyond the Clean Air Act. And actually the Clean Air Act is kind of like written sort of based on theirs, but they have like higher standards for what can be emitted from cars, for instance, like how much pollution can be put in the air. So that's okay. And sometimes the federal government chooses not to address a state law that's in conflict with the federal law, such as, let's go, marijuana laws is the better example. As we know, marijuana is legal in the state of Michigan and a lot of other states in the country. And in some states it's, legal medicinally. In some states it's legal fully. In some states it's not legal at all. Federal law is that marijuana is illegal. So in essence, we should not, like the state of Michigan should not be able to have that law on the books that it's legal. And if the federal government came and said, you need to take this law off the books, that would have to happen, right? But it depends on the administration whether they want to enforce it or not. Obviously, Michigan was not legal. When I say we, I mean Michigan. Michigan was not legal during the Obama administration. However, there were states that were, and the Obama administration came out and said, like, we're not going to fight this in states. And then the Trump administration came out when Jeff Sessions was the attorney general, who was the first attorney general he had. There were several more, but his first attorney general came out and said, we are going to, like, this is a priority of the administration, to contest these state marijuana laws. And then there's so much other stuff that came up that they just never did. And then the Biden administration really hasn't said much about it at all. But if we were, like, we would have to do something about that if the national government came in and said, yeah, no, you can't do that. And it's a lot of the reason why, and I think we've talked about this in class, why, marijuana dispensaries are not typically, like, they're very much like cash businesses, because all banks are in some measure federally regulated. And so if you put money that was obtained from an illegal standpoint federally into a federally regulated bank, it can be seized by, like, the FBI, by federal agents. So it makes things interesting for people who go into that business. Marriage laws, before that case of Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which legalized same-sex marriage on a federal level. Again, that remember, like, court cases don't make federal law. Court cases make it so that laws that are contrary to the decision are unconstitutional. Now, people would then have to continue to fight them. But marriage laws before Obergefell were very much like, state laws, right? So you could, if you're a same-sex couple, you could get married like in the state of Vermont, and then you'd come back to Michigan, and it wouldn't, like, your marriage would not be recognized before the state of Michigan legalized it. But, like, I got married in the state of Florida, and Michigan recognized my marriage. Well, why is that? Well, because I married a man, right? So it was interesting because they were recognizing it in some instances and not others. And so you could argue full faith and credit is not being given to same-sex couples. Interestingly, that's not what that's not the constitutional clause Obergefell used, which I thought would have worked for them. I guess there's some reason why they wouldn't. All right, war power is the next, like, constitutional way that we say, okay, fine, like, the national government is supreme in these instances. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. You don't need to know Clause 1 here, but Article 1, Section 8, you should know. Remember, that's like where all powers are laid out in like to Congress. And then Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. Again, Article 2, you should just know. So Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to declare war. Article 2, Section 2 gives commander-in-chief role to the federal government. And there's many places in the Constitution where it said states cannot wage war. So they have decided that, yeah, states were probably going to like call on you at some point. Like, that'd be cool. But the national government is responsible for protecting this country and its citizens. So again, constitutionally, states cannot wage war. Now, if Canada invades us, which is unlikely, but if they do, we can begin that protection process of ourselves, but then federal troops will take over when they get there. National government can militarize if needed. So like they can take over airports. Of course, that's not in the Constitution because there were no airplanes. Now, this is like the war power. There has been a very, very long-standing battle with respect to how power is separated, but not how power is divided here. So like what I mean is like Congress and the president fight a lot about war power. War Powers Resolution was written in 1973 that basically like took back power to Congress that they felt the president had sort of taken advantage of. But like really never has there been any significant argument between the states and the federal government where the states would be like, no, we should be in charge of national defense. So like that's not really a federalism issue necessarily in terms of like states versus the national government, but it's a place where very distinctly the national government is like the leader in that. Regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Remember, inter is between, intra is within. So again, Article 1, Section 8, there is a clause called the Commerce Clause, okay? And it gives Congress the power, quote, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. Okay. Commerce is economic activity. Production, buying, selling, renting, transporting goods, services, and properties. Okay. Congressional authority extends to all commerce that affects more than one state. Nowadays, almost everything that you buy goes from one state to another. Okay, there's very few things. I mean, like, oh, I went to this farm to table restaurant. Wasn't that great? Okay, fine. But like very few consumer goods don't travel across state lines. And so Congress and the federal government in general can use the Commerce Clause very effectively to justify regulating almost all activity in economic activity, in the U.S. It is the Commerce Clause is one of the most invoked clauses when the federal government is in court trying to back a law. Because if you're in court trying to like figure out whether something is constitutional or not, then you have to invoke a clause. Okay, well, no, because of the necessary and proper clause, we can prove that this is needed and justifiable because of the Commerce Clause, because of the Contracts Clause, because of the Full Faith and Credit Clause, like all of these different clauses, right? Commerce Clause is used a ton. And when we look at federalism court cases, which we will, which we did, I think, I don't know, it depends on the order in which you're watching these. We look at like the push and pull, and it's often on the Commerce Clause, right? So did it shift power toward the federal government? Did it shift power away from the federal government? One of your required cases, U.S. v. Lopez, invokes the Commerce Clause, not effectively on the part of Congress. In fact, that moved power away from the federal government because they didn't argue it properly, or they didn't justify the law properly. They probably should have used something different. All right, power to tax and spend. Of course, like obviously states can do this too, right? But the federal government can raise revenue and spend money for, quote, the general welfare. Most revenue, of course, comes from taxes. It didn't at first, not income tax anyway, until the 16th Amendment. But the deal with the power to tax and spend and how that affects federalism is mostly in terms of grants. And we've called that fiscal federalism. Fiscal just meaning having to do with money, right? Like fiscal policy is tax and spend policy. So the federal government will often give grants or just simply mandates to state governments, local governments, whatever. And that's like they're appropriating money, right? So when they do that, though, they often set conditions or incentives for states. And that is fiscal federalism. So like, we want this to happen and we're going to give you money for doing it. Thanks so much. And if states want that money, whether it goes to education or whether it's farm subsidies or highway money that we talked about before, being tied to the drinking age, right? Then they have to accept the conditions that were put on by the federal government. Little coercive, little restrictive, all under the umbrella of fiscal federalism, okay? So they can use money to force in regulations that they want, but things that are usually left to the states. Okay, so again, we talked about that South Dakota versus Dole case real quick. That's not a required case. I just find it very interesting. When the state of South Dakota sued the federal government, saying that you cannot tie highway funds to a minimum drinking age. And of course, Congress wanted the minimum drinking age throughout the country to be 21. They knew they really didn't have the power to do that. So like they kind of look at a law and say, all right, is this going to be challenged in court and are we going to win? And if they're like, no, we're not. Okay, well then let's use a grant to do it, right? And so they pushed out this grant funding that said, your state will not get funds to improve infrastructure, improve highways, unless you raise your legal drinking age to 21. And of course, most states are like, cool, we're already there, no big deal. Several were at 18 or 19. And so they were not super happy about it being tied to that. So South Dakota sued. South Dakota lost. And like the ruling basically was that the federal government can tie in objectives to grant funding, even if they don't really have much to do with each other. I lost my mouse. Sorry. Several screens. Okay. Federal mandates. Not super popular always. So federal mandate is a requirement, of course, that the national government is imposing as a condition. I'm bummed that I put for receiving federal funds because there's sometimes not funding attached to it. But anyway, federal mandate is basically the national government saying to the states, you got to do this. And states are like, no. And they're like, no, you do. Sorry. And sometimes there is money attached to it. Sometimes there's not money attached to it. Obviously, it's easier when there is money attached to it because anything that has to be implemented by the states typically takes money. So there's a lot of I believe the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, was a mandate that said, okay, like all these buildings, like you have to bring them up to code, meaning you have to have their doors wide enough for wheelchairs to get into. You have to have ramps. You have to have all this kind of stuff, right? Oh, and by the way, we're not giving you any money to make these improvements. So that was technically an unfunded mandate or a underfunded mandate. Like, okay, yeah, sure, here's $1 million, but it's going to cost 10, right? So those are unfunded or underfunded. So anyway, but federal mandates where Congress requires the states to provide specific programs or do specific things. And again, they don't always supply funds, which would be unfunded mandate, or they don't always supply enough funds to be an underfunded mandate. When it's an unfunded mandate or even just a regular mandate, it's difficult for the states to carry out. Like a state budget cannot even approach a federal budget, right? So, and state budgets are usually a lot tighter. And there's just not a ton of wiggle room and discretionary spending on the part of states to be like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like we have an extra $20 million we don't know what to do with, right? That doesn't typically happen. So what ends up happening is that states have to raise taxes, and then people in the state are mad, whatever. Anyway, it doesn't. So federal mandates are difficult. They cause tension between the state and national governments. And it's just like, it's this idea of like states' rights and this, like, in some instances, well, why do we have to meet this national standard? Why do we have to do this? And the federal government saying, well, because everybody should be the same in this particular instance, but also we might not necessarily have the authority to tell you need to be the same, like in terms of a law. All right, so essentially, national or federal government only has powers that are delegated to it, except for foreign affairs, right, which are inherent powers. National government has implied power through Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, necessary and proper. Within the scope of its operations, the national government is supreme, Article 6. And I say within the scope of its operations because, it has to be constitutional what they're doing. State governments have reserve powers, or any power that is not delegated to the federal government, except for those denied to them by the Constitution, which is in the 10th Amendment, also in Article 4. Some powers are specifically denied to both the national and state governments in Article 1. And others are denied to either the state or the national government. So like some things that Congress can't do, and then some things that states can't do. Those are listed in Article 1 and Article 4. And then there's some things that both can't do. So this is kind of where, it just means that things get a little bit hairy, right? Technically, national government is supreme. Sometimes they let the states run with their own laws that are contrary. Sometimes they don't. Sort of depends on the agenda of the administration, like the president that's in office. Sometimes depends on the agenda of Congress. And sometimes it just depends on, really what the federal government truly wants to have happen. So again, lots of different instances. All right. Hopefully you got enough out of that, took some good notes. And we will move on next time I see you. So I will see you later. Bye-bye.